Hello. My name's Chris, I'm 35, and I live in Seattle. I work as a software engineer, the typical 9 to 5, nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills and gives me enough free time to enjoy life. Or at least, I thought I was enjoying life until everything fell apart that I met my wife, Laura, back in college. We were both freshmen at the University of Washington. She was studying communications, always the social butterfly, while I was the quiet guy in the back of the lecture hall. She had this energy about her, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. I was drawn to that. She made life feel exciting, unpredictable, and for a guy like me, that was intoxicating. That we started dating sophomore year, moved in together after graduation, and got married 5 years ago. I thought we had a good thing. Sure, we had our arguments, but who doesn't? I was the steady one, the planner, while she brought spontaneity and adventure into our lives. We balanced each other out, or so I thought. Things started to shift about a year ago. Laura became distant, distracted. She'd spend hours on her phone, claiming she was catching up with work emails or chatting with friends. She'd go out more often, meeting up with people from her networking events or old friends from college. At first, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. We'd been through so much together, and I believed in what we had, but then the late nights started. The work trips that didn't quite add up. The sudden defensiveness whenever I asked simple questions. It was like she was building a wall between us, brick by brick, and I couldn't figure out why. That I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, telling myself I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was, yet. It's funny how you can convince yourself everything's fine, even when the signs are right in front of you. That's where I was trying to hold on to this picture of our marriage that didn't exist anymore. But all it took was one moment, one slip-up, to bring the whole thing crashing down. It was a Thursday night, one of those nights when Laura claimed she had a networking dinner with some colleagues from work. She left the house dressed up more than usual, wearing that red dress I'd bought her for our anniversary a couple of years back. I remember thinking she hadn't worn it for me in a long time. That should have been a clue, but I brushed it off. She kissed me goodbye, said she'd be home late, and just like that, she was out the door. I settled in for a quiet night, ordered some takeout, watched a couple of episodes of a show we used to watch together. But I couldn't shake this feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. Around 10 p.m., I heard her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. She'd forgotten it, which was odd because Laura never left without her phone. It was practically glued to her hand. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the screen. That's when everything unraveled. A string of messages from someone named Eric popped up. I didn't recognize the name, but the words were crystal clear. Can't wait to see you tonight. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Wish you were staying longer this time. My heart dropped. I stared at the screen, hoping I was misreading it, that there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the conversation. It went back weeks: flirty messages, inside jokes, plans to meet up. This wasn't some harmless friendship. This was an affair. And then I saw it. A photo of them together. Smiling. Her arms around him. The same way she used to hold me. That's when it hit me. Eric wasn't just some random guy. He was her classmate from college. I remembered her mentioning him years ago, just in passing, like he was some insignificant part of her past. I never thought twice about it. But clearly, she had. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to my face and walked out that door to be with him? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call her right then and there, confront her, scream into the phone. But another part of me wanted to wait. I needed to see her face when she realized I knew. I sat there, staring at the phone, until I heard her key in the door around midnight. She walked in, acting like everything was normal, setting her purse down and kicking off her heels like it was just another night that I stayed seated on the couch, her phone in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. "Forget something?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. She froze, her eyes darting to the phone in my hand. For a split second, I saw it, the panic, the realization that everything was about to come crashing down. But she recovered quickly, plastering on that fake smile I now knew too well. "Oh, thanks," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "I must have left it when I rushed out." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, waiting for her to dig her own grave. After a moment of silence, I held up the phone. "Eric says hi." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The mask had fallen, and all that was left was guilt and fear, and just like that, everything changed. The silence that filled the room after I said Eric's name was suffocating. Laura stood there, frozen, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how to spin it. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to find an excuse, some way to minimize what I already knew. But there was no coming back from this. That I tossed her phone onto the coffee table, the screen still lit up with their messages. "So, how long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice calm, too calm. It wasn't the explosion I thought would come when I pictured this moment. Instead, it was a quiet, simmering anger, the kind that burns deeper. She blinked, trying to compose herself, but the guilt was written all over her face. "Chris, it's not what you think." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharper now. "Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not. I saw the messages, Laura. I saw the photos." Her shoulders slumped like the weight of her own lies finally crashed down on her. She sighed, looking away like she couldn't even face me. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she mumbled. That I laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's comforting. So, what, you tripped and fell into his bed?" She flinched at that, but I didn't care. I wasn't interested in sparing her feelings. "It just happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We reconnected at a reunion last year, and it started with just talking, reminiscing about old times. I didn't plan for it to go further. But it did," I shot back. "And you kept letting it happen." She finally looked at me then, her eyes filled with something between frustration and guilt. "Things haven't been great between us, Chris. You've been distant, always working. I felt like I was just another part of your routine." I stared at her, the absurdity of her words sinking in. "So that's your excuse? I worked hard to give us a good life, and you repay that by sneaking around with some guy from your past?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The damage was done. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything hanging in the air between us. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we'd built together, it all felt like a cruel joke. How could she throw it all away so easily? Finally, I spoke, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I want you out." Her eyes widened. "Chris, wait, can't we at least talk about this?" I shook my head, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "There's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice, Laura. Now you have to live with it." She tried to argue, but I was done listening. I walked past her, heading to the bedroom to grab a spare blanket and pillow. When I came back, I handed them to her without a word, the finality of it all settling in. "You can sleep on the couch tonight," I said coldly. "But by tomorrow, I want you gone." She stood there, holding the blanket like it was the only thing grounding her. But I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. I went to the bedroom and shut the door behind me, locking it for the first time since we moved in together. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. The anger, the betrayal, the sheer disbelief, it all crashed over me in waves, but beneath it all, there was something else. A strange sense of relief, because now, the lies were out in the open. The facade was shattered. And even though it hurt like hell, at least I knew the truth, and that was the first step toward moving on. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head like a broken record. Every conversation, every moment that now felt tainted. I kept wondering how I could have been so blind. The signs were all there, weren't they? The late nights, the sudden work trips, the way she'd brush me off when I tried to connect. But when you trust someone, when you really believe in them, you don't look for cracks. You believe the foundation is solid. Until it isn't. That I could hear her moving around in the living room. The sound of the couch creaking as she shifted, the occasional soft sniffle when she thought I couldn't hear. But I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel anything for her anymore. That realization hit harder than the betrayal itself. The woman I'd loved, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, was a stranger now. And maybe she had been for a while. When the sun finally started to rise, casting pale light across the room, I got up. I felt like a zombie, running on autopilot. I showered, dressed, and stepped into the living room without saying a word. Laura was awake, sitting on the edge of the couch with the blanket balled up in her lap. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red, her hair a mess, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. I didn't want to hear any more lies. I didn't even want to hear apologies. What was the point? I'm serious, Laura, I said, my voice flat. I want you out by the time I get back from work. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor like she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. Good. She didn't deserve to look me in the eye. I left the apartment without another word. As soon as the door shut behind me, the weight of everything hit me like a freight train. I stood there in the hallway for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I felt like the walls were closing in, like the life I'd built was collapsing around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I made it to my car, but I didn't drive to work. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The anger was there, burning hot in my chest, but underneath it was something worse, the crushing sadness of knowing everything I believed in was a lie. I ended up driving to a nearby park instead. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts swirling like a storm I couldn't outrun. I thought about the first time I met Laura, the way her laugh had drawn me in, how I'd felt like the luckiest guy in the world when she agreed to go out with me. I thought about our wedding day, standing at the altar, looking into her eyes and believing with every fiber of my being that we were forever, but forever doesn't mean much when someone else decides they're done trying. I sat on a bench by the water, watching the ripples spread across the surface, and for the first time since I found those messages, I let myself feel it. The betrayal. The heartbreak. The sheer, gut-wrenching pain of knowing the person you love chose someone else over you. I felt stupid. I felt angry. But most of all, I felt empty. I didn't know how long I sat there before my phone buzzed. It was Jake, my best friend since college. I'd been avoiding telling him, avoiding saying it out loud because saying it made it real. But I needed someone. I couldn't carry this alone anymore. Hey, man, I answered, my voice hoarse. Chris? You good? You sound off. And just like that, the dam broke. I told him everything, the messages, the affair, the confrontation. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even speechless, but he wasn't. That's messed up, man, he said, his voice filled with the kind of anger only a best friend can have for you. I'm coming over tonight. I didn't argue. For once, I was grateful for the company. When I finally went back home, Laura was gone. Her keys were on the kitchen counter, along with a note scribbled on a piece of paper. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. No amount of words could fix what she'd broken. The apartment felt different now. Colder. Quieter. But not in a bad way. It was like I could finally breathe, even if every breath still hurt. That night, Jake showed up with a six-pack and takeout. We didn't talk much at first, just sat in the living room, eating and drinking in silence. But eventually, he looked over at me and said, you know this isn't your fault, right? I wanted to believe him. I really did. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was to blame. Maybe I hadn't been enough. Maybe I'd missed something, some sign that could have stopped all of this from happening, but deep down, I knew the truth. Cheating isn't a mistake, it's a choice. And Laura made her choice. As the night went on, the sadness started to shift. It didn't disappear, but it settled into something more manageable. A dull ache instead of a sharp stab. And in that quiet space, I realized something important. This wasn't the end. It felt like it, sure. But it wasn't. It was just the beginning of something new. I didn't know what that was yet, but for the first time since everything fell apart, I was ready to find out. The days after Laura left felt like walking through a fog. Everything was familiar, the same streets, the same routine, but it all felt off, like I was watching my life from the outside. The apartment was quieter, colder, but strangely, it wasn't as suffocating as I thought it'd be. Maybe that was the first sign things were shifting, even if I didn't realize it yet. That I spent that first week in survival mode. I went to work, came home, ate whatever takeout I could stomach, and repeated the cycle. The bed felt too big, the empty side a constant reminder of what was gone. But as much as it hurt, there was also this odd sense of relief beneath it all, like I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. The truth was out, and I didn't have to guess or hope or fight for something that wasn't real. Jake kept checking in, refusing to let me wallow in silence for too long. He'd show up with food or suggest going out for drinks, anything to get me out of the apartment. At first, I resisted. I wasn't ready to face the world, to pretend like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. But eventually, I gave in. One Friday night, about 2 weeks after Laura moved out, Jake dragged me to our usual bar. It was the kind of place where the lights were low, the music wasn't too loud, and the bartender knew our orders by heart. I hadn't been there since before everything blew up, and walking through those doors felt like stepping into a different life. We grabbed a booth in the corner, and for a while, we just sat there in comfortable silence, nursing our drinks. It wasn't until the second round that Jake finally said what I knew he'd been thinking. You know, man, she didn't deserve you. I stared into my glass, swirling the ice around. Yeah, well, that doesn't make it hurt any less. He nodded, understanding. But you'll get through it. You're stronger than you think. I didn't feel strong. I felt broken, like I'd been gutted and left to figure out how to put myself back together. But hearing Jake say it, even if I didn't believe it yet, planted a seed I didn't know I needed. That night, I went home feeling a little lighter. The pain was still there, sure, but it wasn't as sharp. It was like I'd finally taken the first breath after holding it in for too long. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of determination. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what happened. I needed to reclaim my space, my life. This apartment wasn't just a reminder of Laura's betrayal, it was still my home. And it was time to make it feel like that again. That I started with small things. I took down the photos of us, the framed memories that now felt like lies. I boxed up the stuff she left behind, her books, her clothes, the little knickknacks that used to make the apartment feel cozy but now just felt like clutter. It wasn't about erasing her, it was about making room for something new. I rearranged the furniture, repainted the walls, even bought a new set of dishes. It sounds silly, but those little changes made a huge difference. With every shift, every fresh coat of paint, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. The apartment started to feel like mine again, not ours, not hers, just mine. I also picked up my camera for the first time in months. Photography had always been my escape, a way to see the world differently. But somewhere along the way, I'd let it slip through my fingers, buried under work and, well, life. But standing there with my camera in hand, framing the world through a lens, reminded me of who I was before everything went wrong. It wasn't just about keeping busy, it was about rediscovering the parts of me that got lost in the mess. I wasn't just Chris, the husband, anymore. I was me. And that was enough. There were still tough days. I'd catch myself thinking about Laura, wondering what she was doing, if she regretted anything. But those moments didn't control me like they used to. They were fleeting, like passing clouds instead of constant storms. One evening, I got a message from an unknown number. I knew who it was before I even opened it. "I hope you're doing okay. I miss you." For a second, I just stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar sting to hit. But it didn't. Instead, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a calm clarity. She missed me? Maybe. But it didn't matter anymore. She made her choice, and I was finally making mine. That I didn't respond. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and set my phone down with a sense of finality. That simple act felt like closing the door on a chapter that no longer served me. Later that night, as I sat on my freshly rearranged couch, looking around at the apartment that finally felt like home again, I realized something important: that I wasn't just surviving. I was healing, and for the first time in a long time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, the best was yet to come. Healing isn't this clean, linear process people make it out to be. It's messy. Some days you wake up feeling like you've finally turned a corner, and other days it feels like you've been sucker punched by a memory you didn't even know was still lingering. But little by little, the good days started to outnumber the bad. That I threw myself into photography more, taking weekend trips to places I'd never been, just me and my camera. It was therapeutic in a way I didn't expect. There was something freeing about seeing the world through a lens, focusing on the details, capturing fleeting moments, and realizing that life was still happening all around me, even if it felt like mine had been on pause. One of those weekends, I stumbled upon this little coffee shop tucked away in an alley downtown. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Faded sign, creaky wooden floors, mismatched furniture. But the vibe was warm, inviting, like it was made for people trying to find their footing again. That's where I met Maya. She was sitting at the counter, sketching in a notebook with this intense focus, like the world outside didn't exist. I probably wouldn't have said anything. Small talk wasn't exactly my thing, but as fate would have it, I accidentally spilled my coffee trying to sit down at the stool next to hers. Classic. She looked up, startled at first, then laughed when she saw the mess I'd made. It wasn't one of those polite, obligatory chuckles either. It was genuine, infectious. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed too. We struck up a conversation, and it flowed effortlessly. No awkward pauses, no overthinking. Just two strangers talking about art, life, and everything in between. It felt easy. And I hadn't felt easy in a long time. We exchanged numbers before I left, and over the next few weeks, we started meeting up regularly. Coffee turned into walks around the city, which turned into late-night talks about our pasts, our dreams, and the messy middle where we both found ourselves. I told her about Laura, about the betrayal, about how I was still piecing myself back together. She listened without judgment, without pity. Just listened. Maya had her own scars too. She'd been through a rough breakup, different circumstances but similar feelings. That shared experience created this unspoken understanding between us. We weren't trying to fix each other, just be there while we figured it out ourselves. For a while, I questioned whether I was ready for anything new. The idea of trusting someone again felt daunting, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no guarantee you'd land safely. But with Maya, it didn't feel like I was rushing into anything. It felt like I was finally learning how to let someone in without losing myself in the process. One night, after we'd spent hours wandering through the city, we found ourselves sitting on a bench overlooking the water. The moonlight reflected off the surface, casting everything in this soft, silvery glow. It was quiet, but not the kind of silence that felt heavy. It was comfortable. She turned to me, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you think you're ready to move on?" It wasn't a loaded question, just a simple, honest one. I thought about it for a moment, staring out at the water. "I don't know if 'ready' is the right word," I said finally. "But I'm not stuck anymore. And I think that's a start." She smiled, squeezing my hand gently. "That's more than a start. And she was right that it wasn't about having all the answers or being completely healed. It was about taking steps forward, even if they were small, even if I stumbled along the way. Because healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to live with it without letting it define you. Over time, things with Maya grew naturally. There was no pressure, no need to label what we were. It wasn't about rushing into the next chapter to forget the last one. It was about writing something new, something honest, without the weight of old wounds holding me back. I realized that Laura's betrayal, as painful as it was, didn't break me. It revealed me. It showed me who I was when everything fell apart and who I could become when I chose to put the pieces back together. One evening, as Maya and I sat on the balcony of my apartment, finally free of the ghosts that used to haunt it, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. Not the fragile kind that disappears with the next bad day, but the kind that settles deep, like roots anchoring you to the ground. I turned to her, my voice soft but certain. You know, I used to think what Laura did would define me forever. But now, I'm grateful. She raised an eyebrow, curious. Grateful? I nodded, smiling. Yeah. Because without that, I wouldn't have found myself again. I wouldn't have found this. And that's the thing about life, it has a funny way of leading you exactly where you need to be, even if the journey there is painful. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe things with Maya will last, maybe they won't. But I do know one thing, I'm not afraid of the unknown anymore, because no matter what happens, I've learned how to stand on my own. I've learned that my worth isn't tied to someone else's ability to see it. And I've learned that even the deepest wounds can heal, leaving behind not just scars, but strength. It's strange how life can shift when you stop trying to control every part of it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for disappointment or betrayal. I was just living. And that simple act felt like a victory. Maya and I continued to spend time together, but it wasn't the center of my universe the way things had been with Laura. I'd learned the hard way that losing yourself in a relationship doesn't end well. So instead, I focused on building a life that felt full on its own, one where companionship was a choice, not a crutch. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching photography workshops on weekends. It wasn't something I'd planned, but a friend mentioned they needed help, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of a group of teenagers, sharing the passion that had helped pull me out of my darkest moments. Watching them discover their own creative voices reminded me how powerful it is to find something that lights you up inside. There was one kid, Marcus, who reminded me a lot of myself at that age, quiet, reserved, always sitting in the back of the room. But when he picked up a camera, it was like a switch flipped. The way he saw the world through that lens was different, raw, honest. One day after class, he stayed behind and asked, "How do you know when you're good at something?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. It's not about being good. It's about how it makes you feel when you're doing it. If it feels right, that's what matters. He nodded, processing my words, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't just giving him advice, I was reminding myself too. It wasn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It was about showing up for yourself, day after day, even when it's hard. Meanwhile, things with Maya continued to evolve in this quiet, steady way. We weren't rushing toward anything, but the connection deepened naturally. She understood my boundaries, respected the space I needed to continue healing, and in turn, I did the same for her. There was no pressure, no need to constantly define where we were or where we were going. We were just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. One night, after a particularly long day at work and an impromptu photography session at the park, we ended up back at my apartment. We were sitting on the floor, surrounded by takeout containers and half-empty wine glasses, flipping through the photos we'd taken that evening. The laughter came easy, the kind that bubbles up from somewhere deep and feels effortless. Then, out of nowhere, Maya looked at me, her expression soft but serious. "Do you ever think about her? About Laura?" It wasn't an accusation or a trap. Just an honest question from someone who cared enough to ask. I took a deep breath, considering my answer carefully. Sometimes, I admitted. But not in the way I used to. It's more like remembering a chapter in a book I've already finished. I don't feel connected to it anymore. She nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. It's hard, isn't it? Letting go of something that once meant everything? I met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words. Yeah. But holding on to it would have been even harder. And that was the truth. Letting go wasn't about pretending it never happened. It was about acknowledging the pain, learning from it, and choosing not to let it define me. As the months passed, the life I was building felt more solid, more me. The apartment no longer felt like a monument to a broken marriage. It was filled with new memories, new energy, and a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The walls that once echoed with betrayal now resonated with laughter, creativity, and growth. I found myself reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted from during my marriage. It was strange at first, like stepping back into a life I'd left behind, but those relationships grounded me in ways I didn't expect. They reminded me that life moves on, even when you think it won't. One evening, while catching up with Jake over drinks, he raised his glass and said, "You're not the same guy you were a year ago." I chuckled, clinking my glass against his. Thank God for that. But later, as I walked home, his words echoed in my mind. He was right. I wasn't the same guy. I was stronger, more self-aware, and finally comfortable in my own skin. I'd stopped looking for validation from others and started trusting myself again. One afternoon, months after Laura had left, I received an email from her. It was short, just a few lines about how she hoped I was doing well and that she'd been thinking about reaching out sooner. She said she regretted how things ended and wished me happiness. I stared at the message for a while, waiting for some kind of emotional reaction. But there was none. No anger, no sadness, no desire for closure. I didn't need anything from her, not an apology, not an explanation. I'd already found my peace. I didn't respond. I simply archived the email and went back to editing photos for my latest workshop, feeling lighter than I ever had before, because the truth is, healing doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow, often painful process, but when you come out the other side, you realize something incredible. You're not just surviving, you're thriving. I didn't know exactly where life would take me next, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me, because I wasn't defined by my past. I was defined by how I chose to move forward, and I was finally ready for whatever came next. It's funny how life starts to feel lighter when you finally stop carrying the weight of things that no longer serve you. For so long, I'd been dragging around the aftermath of Laura's betrayal like it was some permanent scar. But somewhere between the late-night walks, the photography workshops, and the quiet moments with Maya, that weight started to lift. It didn't disappear overnight. Healing never works like that. But it loosened its grip, and I finally felt like I was standing tall again. One day, I was cleaning out the last of the boxes I'd shoved into the back of my closet, the ones I couldn't bring myself to touch after Laura left. They were filled with memories I thought I'd never be able to face without feeling that familiar sting of betrayal. But as I pulled them out, dust-covered and forgotten, I realized I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I found old photos of us from our college days, laughing at some party, road tripping down the coast, moments that once felt like the happiest times of my life. But now, looking at them, I didn't feel pain. I felt gratitude. Not for the betrayal, obviously, but for the good times we did share. For the lessons I'd learned. For the growth that followed the heartbreak. I didn't throw the photos away. I didn't need to. They were just pictures now, snapshots of a different time, a different version of me. And that was okay. Because I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone better. Maya came over later that evening. She noticed the open box and the photos scattered on the table. "You okay?" she asked gently, her eyes flicking from the pictures to me. I nodded, smiling. "Yeah. I think I finally am." We spent the evening talking about everything and nothing, like we always did. There was an ease with her that I hadn't experienced in years. Not just because of who she was, but because of who I'd become. I wasn't clinging to her for comfort or validation. I didn't need her to fill some void left by Laura. I was whole on my own, and that made being with her even more meaningful. As the months rolled on, my life started to feel like it was truly mine again. I found joy in the little things: early morning runs through the park, lazy Sunday afternoons spent editing photos, impromptu road trips with friends. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was living. I even started taking on freelance photography gigs, small stuff at first, like local events and portraits, but it reignited a passion I hadn't felt in a long time. There was something incredibly fulfilling about capturing moments for other people, knowing I was freezing a piece of their happiness in time. It reminded me that life is full of beautiful, fleeting moments if you're open to seeing them. One of those gigs led me to an unexpected opportunity. A gallery downtown was hosting a showcase for local photographers, and a friend encouraged me to submit some of my work. I was hesitant at first. Putting yourself out there after being torn down isn't easy. But I realized that holding back because of fear wasn't an option anymore. So I did it. I submitted my photos, the ones I'd taken during those quiet, healing months when I was rediscovering who I was. And to my surprise, they were accepted. The night of the showcase, I stood in the gallery, surrounded by strangers admiring my work. It was surreal. People were stopping to look at my photos, talking about the emotion in them, the story behind the images. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving my past, I was thriving in spite of it. Maya showed up halfway through the evening, her eyes lighting up when she saw my work displayed on the walls. She pulled me into a hug, whispering, "I'm so proud of you," and for the first time, I really let those words sink in, because I was proud of me too. After the gallery closed for the night, we walked through the city, the cool night air buzzing with that electric feeling you get when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. At one point, Maya stopped, turning to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things hadn't fallen apart with Laura?" It was a question I hadn't asked myself in a long time. But standing there, with the city lights reflecting in her eyes and the weight of my past firmly behind me, I knew the answer. "I don't," I said honestly. "Because if things hadn't fallen apart, I wouldn't be here. And here is exactly where I want to be." She smiled, slipping her hand into mine as we continued down the street, and I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. Not because everything in my life was perfect, but because I'd learned to embrace the imperfections. The unexpected twists and turns that led me to this moment. Life isn't about avoiding pain or heartbreak. It's about finding the strength to rise after you've fallen. It's about discovering who you are when the dust settles and realizing that the version of you that emerges from the wreckage is stronger, wiser, and more resilient than you ever imagined, and that's where I was. Standing on solid ground, not because someone else had pulled me up, but because I'd learned how to lift myself. The best part? I knew this was just the beginning. It's amazing how life has this way of surprising you when you least expect it. Not just with the hard stuff, but with the good stuff, too, the kind that sneaks up on you, quiet and steady, until one day you realize you're not just okay, you're happy. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined being here. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Back then, everything felt like it was crumbling: my marriage, my trust, my sense of self. I thought Laura's betrayal would be the defining moment of my life, the thing that cast a shadow over everything that came after. But standing here now, I know better. Her betrayal wasn't the end of my story, it was just the catalyst for something better. After the gallery showcase, things with Maya continued to evolve. We weren't rushing toward anything grand or dramatic, but we were building something real, something grounded in honesty and mutual respect. There was no pressure to be perfect, no fear of the past creeping into the present. We both knew what it felt like to be broken, and we understood that healing wasn't about fixing each other. It was about growing together, side by side. But the most important relationship I nurtured during that time wasn't with Maya, or my friends, or even my family. It was the relationship I rebuilt with myself that I learned to love my own company again, to sit with my thoughts without drowning in them, to find joy in the simple things, like a quiet morning with a cup of coffee or an evening run with nothing but my breath and the rhythm of my footsteps to keep me grounded. I wasn't just filling the empty spaces that Laura left behind, I was creating a life that felt full on its own. A few months after the showcase, I decided to take a solo trip. It wasn't something I'd ever done before. Traveling alone always seemed intimidating, like it would force me to confront things I wasn't ready to face. But that was the point. I wanted to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone else to feel complete. That I booked a flight to Colorado, packed my camera, and set off with no real plan other than to explore, to breathe, to exist. I hiked through national parks, camped under the stars, and captured some of the most breathtaking landscapes I'd ever seen. But the most beautiful thing I discovered on that trip wasn't a mountain range or a sunset, it was me. The version of myself that was strong, capable, and content, even in solitude. One evening, sitting by a campfire with nothing but the crackle of the flames and the vastness of the night sky above me, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. Not because life was perfect, but because I'd finally made peace with its imperfections. The pain, the betrayal, the uncertainty, they were all part of the journey that led me here. When I got back home, I felt like a new person. Or maybe, more accurately, I felt like myself for the first time in a long time. I shared the photos from my trip with Maya, with friends, even submitted a few to local publications. The feedback was incredible, but more than the praise, it was the process that mattered to me. Creating something from a place of authenticity, from a heart that had been broken but refused to stay shattered, that was the real victory. One night, a few weeks after my trip, I found myself back at the same coffee shop where I'd first met Maya. We were sitting at our usual spot, sipping our drinks, when she turned to me with that thoughtful look she always got when she was about to say something important. "You seem different," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Lighter." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my chest. "I think I finally let go of the last pieces of the past." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. "You deserve every bit of happiness you found." And I believed her. Because I knew I'd earned it. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Laura. I hadn't heard from her since that brief email months ago, and seeing her handwriting brought a wave of unexpected emotions. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, wondering if it would stir up old wounds, but as I read her words, an apology, a reflection on her mistakes, and a hope that I'd found peace, I realized something profound: that I didn't need her apology, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I'd already found my closure long before her letter arrived. I'd built a life that wasn't defined by what she did or didn't say. I didn't harbor anger or resentment anymore. I just moved on. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and didn't think about it again, because my life wasn't about Laura anymore. It was about me. I'm not going to pretend like everything is perfect now. Life is still messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. But I've learned that perfection isn't the goal. Growth is. And I've grown in ways I never thought possible. I've learned that betrayal doesn't break you unless you let it. I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting the past, but learning to live with it without letting it control you. And most importantly, I've learned that happiness isn't something you find in another person, it's something you create within yourself. So, if you're reading this, wondering if you'll ever get past the pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal, you will. It won't happen overnight. It'll hurt like hell some days. But you'll wake up one morning, and the weight will feel a little lighter. You'll laugh without forcing it. You'll find joy in places you never expected. And one day, you'll realize that you're not just surviving, you're thriving, because the end of one chapter isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of a better one.